Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We're going to build out your mental toolkit for recognizing toxic management and, more importantly, mastering ethical servant leadership. Look, if you've ever worked somewhere where things just felt vaguely off, but you couldn't really pinpoint why, well, this one is absolutely for you. Today, we're dissecting the actual mechanics of how good cultures go bad and how we can build them back up with unshakable integrity.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the dark side of power, move into toxic cultures and favoritism, find our inner compass, look at servant leadership in action, and finally, talk about detoxifying the culture.
All right, starting us off, part one, the dark side of power.
So, to really understand healthy leadership, we've got to look at the clinical reality of what unchecked power actually does to the human brain. And I mean literal brain changes, it's not just a metaphor. We have this really arresting quote from Jerry Useem in The Atlantic saying power causes brain damage. It introduces us to something called hubris syndrome. Basically, as leaders gain significant power, they can literally lose their capacity to empathize with others. They actually stop being able to mirror the feelings of the people around them. So the higher up the ladder they go, the more isolated their brains become from the human reality of their own decisions. Kind of scary, right?
And this perfectly illustrates what we call the empathy deficit. We've seen this clinically in massive corporate disasters. Take the Nokia collapse, for example. Their leadership suffered such an empathetic disconnect that middle managers were literally terrified to tell them the truth about the rising smartphone market. Or think about the 2008 financial crisis. You had leaders stuck in this hubris loop, identifying so strongly with that master of the universe archetype that they went totally blind to the massive systemic risks they were taking. It's like they were flying a giant commercial jet with completely broken gauges.
Which brings us to section 2, toxic cultures and favoritism.
Let's look at how this hubris trickles down into everyday organizational toxicity. Specifically, we need to focus on how favoritism acts as a silent killer of teams. Because honestly, toxic leadership rarely looks like a cartoon villain. Most of the time, it just looks like a manager playing favorites. If we look at the academic model developed by researcher April Chaput, we see the exact pre-existing conditions that breed this toxicity. Basically, favoritism spreads like wildfire when there's a lack of transparency, unclear decision-making criteria, and zero accountability. When standard procedures break down, leaders start making decisions based on personal feelings and buddy-buddy relationships instead of actual objective ability. Now, what's really fascinating here is the direct downstream impact. When supervisors make choices based on their own subjective preferences rather than hard metrics, the fallout is severe. Subordinates pick up on this inequality instantly, and what happens? Both performance and team morale just plummet. It completely sucks the motivation right out of the room.
We see this play out constantly in everyday selective listening. Picture a standard marketing meeting, right? The intern, Tom, pitches a really smart idea to jump on a TikTok trend. The manager shoots it down. But then, a few minutes later, Cassie, who happens to be a favorite employee, pitches literally the exact same TikTok idea. Suddenly, the manager loves it and gives Cassie all the credit. That right there is selective listening in action. Tom is fuming, the whole team sees the blatant unfairness, and just like that, trust is fractured.
And taken to its absolute extreme, this refusal to tolerate dissent and the obsession with a favored in-group leads to catastrophic ethical failures. The Theranos collapse is the ultimate case study in this. Elizabeth Holmes built a $9 billion corporate disaster on a cult-like culture. Any dissent was completely silenced, whistleblowers faced brutal retaliation, and the end result was massive fraud and organizational dehumanization. $9 billion just gone.
So, that brings us to a really critical turning point in our explainer. When the stakes are high and the temptation to rely on ego or play favorites is staring you in the face, how do we actively prevent these disasters? How do we lead with clarity instead of hubris?
That leads us right into section 3, the inner compass.
The answer to avoiding all that hubris lies in replacing ego with something far, far more reliable, an inner compass rooted in deep emotional intelligence and unwavering integrity. Now, the crucial thing to understand here are the 4 powers of integrity. And hear me out, these aren't just abstract feel-good buzzwords, they're repeatable, embodied actions. Appreciative awareness reduces turnover because you're actively recognizing everyone's value. Authentic resonance creates psychological safety through totally honest communication. Creative responsibility builds trust because you're actually owning the impact of your decisions. And impeccable completion ensures a reliable environment because you follow through. Together, these powers literally metabolize emotional friction into solid trust.
Adding to our mental toolkit, these core principles show us that integrity is our true north, but it requires continuous learning. Look at legendary leaders like GE's Jack Welch. He was a massive advocate for lifelong learning, constantly challenging his own assumptions. Or Intel's Andy Grove. He intentionally created a culture of fierce debate, specifically so he wouldn't just be surrounded by yes-men. That kind of continuous learning is how successful leaders actually manage risk and keep their perspectives sharp.
And this points to a really beautiful truth. You can be incredibly driven without being selfish. Abraham Lincoln is often cited as the premier historical case study for this. He perfectly balanced deep, profound humility with an absolute, resolute determination to preserve the Union. He wasn't leading to stroke his own ego. He led to navigate the country through an unimaginable storm, sticking strictly to his core principles even when facing intense, relentless criticism.
All right, moving on to Section 4, Servant Leadership in Action. Let's transition from those internal compass principles to outward, observable behaviors. What does all this internal integrity actually look like when it hits the office floor? Well, servant leadership completely flips the traditional corporate hierarchy upside down. Instead of demanding absolute command and compliance, the leader essentially assumes the role of the servant. They prioritize the team's needs through deep listening, practicing radical empathy, facilitating safe spaces for healing, and acting as true stewards of their people and resources. Their ultimate metric for success? It's the personal and professional growth of everyone around them.
And we see this succeeding wildly out in the real world. Companies like Southwest Airlines and Zappos have built these incredibly resilient cultures simply by fostering community and a genuine sense of belonging. Starbucks even explicitly bakes this into their training with their Coffee Master program. It's not just about making a great latte. It actually teaches managers active listening, mentorship, and how to build a truly inclusive environment.
Why do these massive companies invest so heavily in this? Well, as Stephen Covey famously put it, trust is basically like oil for an organization's engine. Without trust, the whole engine just seizes up with friction, paranoia, and terrible morale. But with trust, communication flows effortlessly, risks are managed collaboratively, and the entire system runs at a much faster, healthier pace.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Detoxifying the Culture. Okay, let's get highly practical here. Say you find yourself in an environment that is already seized up. Trust is gone, hubris is running the show. How do we actually detoxify a damaged culture and set things right? Well, the very first tool in our kit is objective decision-making. We have to consciously strip away our natural biases and that urge to play favorites. You do this by relying on hard data and countable metrics over subjective feelings. You score candidates on uniform, job-relevant criteria. And honestly, most importantly, you actively cultivate a culture of debate where dissenting opinions aren't just tolerated, they are openly rewarded. Next, we have to adopt the habits of highly mindful leaders. This means consciously focusing on the present moment and slowing down our racing thoughts. When a crisis hits, a mindful leader does not react impulsively out of stress or a need to protect their own ego. No, they pause. They use introspective self-awareness. They manage their energy and respond intentionally, keeping an open, beginner's mind to completely avoid bias.
We also have to embrace non-attachment and absolutely ditch this hero archetype we so often idolize. Newsflash, even the healthiest, most effective leaders make mistakes. But when a leader actually publicly owns their missteps, apologizes, and genuinely seeks feedback, it is transformative. It fundamentally alters the dynamic of the team because it proves that repairing a mistake is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than trying to prevent it in the first place.
All of these actions ultimately build towards one massive goal: psychological safety. Coined by researcher Amy Edmondson, this is the foundational bedrock required for any team to actually thrive. It's an environment where disagreement, vulnerability, and honesty are entirely safe. They aren't punished, they're protected. It is the exact opposite of what we saw with Theranos or Nokia. It's a culture driven by truth rather than fear. So I want to leave you with a provocative thought to add to your mental toolkit. Take a really hard look at your own working environment. Where might subtle toxicity, maybe a lack of transparency, a bit of selective listening, or a stubborn reluctance to admit mistakes be showing up? Because naming what's broken is the very first and most crucial step in actually healing the culture. Thank you so much for exploring the architecture of ethical leadership with me today.